Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us for this. This is the fourth 4M seminar of 2023 now. I'm Dr. Gemma Sharp from the University of Exeter, and I run 4M, which stands for the Menarche, Menstruation, Menopause and Mental Health Consortium. We're a multinational, multi-institutional, multidisciplinary network of researchers and stakeholders interested in the intersection of menstrual and mental health. And we're really delighted today to be joined by Dr. Lynsay Matthews, who's going to talk to us about her really important research to understand the research priorities for premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD, in the UK. So Lynsay is a lecturer in public health at the University of the West of Scotland, and she's also the co-author of the MRC and NIHR's updated framework for developing and evaluating complex interventions. And so the work that she's describing today is all in line with that updated framework. So please stick around for questions at the end. You can feel free to put them in the chat, or I can ask you to unmute at the end. And yeah, thanks again for joining. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Lynsay. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma, and hello, everybody. So I'm Lynsay Matthews, and I work in the Division of Biological Sciences and Health at University of West of Scotland, UWS. And I have a really keen interest in women's mental health. So I'm specifically interested in premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD. So thank you to 4M for the invite for today's seminar. Today, there's a couple of things I hope you can take away from today. So one of those is an increased awareness of PMDD. So some of you might already know about it, some maybe not so much. And the second thing is an awareness of the UK's upcoming research agenda for PMDD. So it's going to be launched in mid-May, not the 2nd of May, which I said in the advert. So launched in mid-May, and this is a little sneak peek of what's going to be involved. Just a little heads up that I'm having a little bit of trouble with my eyes today. So if the bright lights get a little bit too much, I might have to pop on my Top Gun glasses later. So if that happens, you know why. So just a little note on terminology before we start the talk today. So although we talk about women's mental health, hormone-based mental health also affects individuals who were assigned female at birth, but may no longer identify as female. So for example, non-binary individuals or transgender. So when I'm talking, I typically use the term people with PMDD. So let's start by differentiating between premenstrual symptoms. So here you can see a spectrum of premenstrual symptoms. The majority of women will experience some form of a premenstrual symptom at some point in their menstrual cycle. So whether this be mild physical or mood changes or more severe forms of symptoms. But what we will focus on today is this far extreme of the spectrum, so PMDD. So this stands for premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And the reason that we talk about that separately is because it is recognised as a mental disorder in the DSM-5 and recognised as a standalone medical condition in the ICD-11. So these are international standards for disorders. You might come across people using the term PMDD and severe PMS interchangeably. This is something that might evolve as we gather more and more research data on this far extreme of the spectrum. So before I come on to describing PMDD, it's worth mentioning the huge leaps in PMDD awareness over the last few years. So until recently, PMDD wasn't spoken about widely. But off the back of some amazing work by the key support organisations, so those are the International Association of Premenstrual Disorders, Vicious Cycle, and the National Association of Premenstrual Syndrome, there has been a great increase in awareness. For example, some of you may have heard about PMDD from the BBC documentary. It was launched in 2020. Or you might have come across PMDD in some mainstream media articles. Or more recently, you might have seen the new storyline in the UK soap opera Emmerdale, where one of the characters, Kathy, is diagnosed with PMDD. And big kudos to IAPMD for their behind-the-scenes work in making the Emmerdale storyline happen. So for those of us here who are maybe not familiar with PMDD, let's start by saying, what is PMDD? Well, it's a severe hormone-based mood disorder. It affects 1 in 20 women and people who menstruate. It's a key driver of poor mental health because 72% of people with PMDD experience suicidal thoughts. And 51%, that's over half of people with PMDD, will self-harm. And 1 in 3 people with PMDD will attempt suicide. Now, if PMDD affects 1 in 20 people who menstruate, that means that most of us likely know somebody that has PMDD. And one of the difficulties is that person themselves might not know about PMDD because of the issues around awareness. So what we really need is increased awareness and also the right type of high quality research so that we can support those people in our lives with suicidal thoughts, self-harm prevention, and being able to function long-term throughout life. So let's describe a little bit more about PMDD. So symptoms occur in the second half of the menstrual cycle. So this is known as the luteal phase. It's that phase between ovulation and the first day of the period. So in this luteal phase, people with PMDD experience debilitating psychological symptoms, which impact on their day-to-day functioning. Now, these symptoms range from overwhelming depression, anxiety, and rage to hopelessness, despair, and suicidal thoughts. People can also experience somatic, cognitive, and physical symptoms such as insomnia, sensitivity to sounds, and other symptoms. And the key thing is that PMDD is characterized by these symptoms lifting when someone starts their period. And this creates a cyclical pattern every month, typically for decades. So today, I'm not going to talk about the causes or the science behind PMDD, but like to focus on our work of creating the UK's first research agenda. So my co-author on this is Julie Riddle from the University of Glasgow, and we also have a lot of people to thank for their support. So we have our funders, which were through the University of Birmingham QR funding, the ESRC Impact Accelerator Fund, and also some fantastic support from IAPMD, NAPS, and the 4M Consortium for helping promote the research agenda work that helped create what we're about to share today. So why do we need a research agenda? So on those previous slides, I had been talking about is increasing awareness, but with increasing awareness comes an increase in people who will be diagnosed and need support. And there's no evidence to suggest that that yet exists to a high quality in the UK. So we wanted to find out what were the key areas that we could focus on moving forward and have that informed by the people that matter. So we gathered information and insight and ideas from a wide range of stakeholders. And we did this using 3 different methods. So the first of those was a range of focus groups. And in those focus groups, we wanted to speak with people with PMDD, different health professionals, researchers, support organisations, and emergency crisis personnel. And what I mean by that are people like paramedics or staff in accident and emergency or suicide prevention crisis services. After those focus groups, we took some of that data and we fed that into a nationwide consultation. And from that, we gathered 208 responses, again, from this wide variety of stakeholders. And those perspectives came from people with different characteristics around ethnicity and gender identity, and from different perspectives. And then we fed all of that insight into one final stakeholder workshop, where we had a range of stakeholders help us finalise and agree consensus for the new research agenda. Now, what that showed us was that there were consistently 5 key research priorities that were agreed upon, regardless of who the stakeholder was. So there were 5 top priorities, and that's what I'm going to focus on sharing with you today. Alongside that, there were other priority areas for research which were identified, and we also had ideas specifically brought up by stakeholders that might be important for future research. So I'm going to talk you through the 5 key priority areas with a little flavour of what people were saying about that, and also align that with what we know about this research area to start with. So the first research priority, which was agreed by all the different stakeholders, was that we need more research on diagnosis and management. So as you can see here, people with PMDD described difficult experiences in trying to seek support, in trying to seek a diagnosis, and in trying to seek treatment and management for their symptoms. So this person here says that they have been through mental health services for a decade, and in that time have had different diagnoses, but at no point has anyone considered to explore the role of the menstrual cycle. And it wasn't only people with PMDD who were frustrated by the diagnosis and treatment process. What we also found from our focus groups was that healthcare professionals, whether that's GPs, gynecologists, or clinical psychiatrists, they also felt frustrated by the lack of training on menstrual health and PMDD in their training years, and that they also were frustrated by the lack of pathways that they could use to support their patients. So what do we know already about diagnosis and management? Well, we know that despite being included in the DSM-5 and the ICD, and despite there being evidence-based guidelines for treatment, data shows that it takes on average 12 years for someone to receive an accurate diagnosis of PMDD. And in that time frame, studies show that people might be misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, or other major mood disorders such as depression or anxiety. And now this typically leads to inappropriate medications which don't work for PMDD. Studies from other countries show that although tracking the menstrual cycle is the key diagnostic criteria, very few health professionals are using that as part of a management plan. Other things we know about diagnosis and treatment are that certain types of antidepressants are the most effective treatment for PMDD. but we also have evidence to show that people are not being offered those as the first-line treatment as recommended by the guidelines. So what do we still need to be answered? If we were going to use this research priority to take forward, what do we still need to know? So it's important to know what happens to people when they do seek support. What is that experience like for them in the UK? And vice versa, what is the experience like for the healthcare professional? What barriers do they have for diagnosis and management, and how can they be supported? And also there's emerging data which suggests that PMDD may present as different subtypes, and that's an important thing for clinical practice, but we need a lot more information on it. So that's a kind of summary around research priority 1. Research priority 2 was around best approaches for psychological support. Now, these thoughts were different from treatment and management because people considered that having psychological support for a chronic mood disorder was something that was different and standalone than medication. So despite PMDD being a chronic mood disorder, typically experienced over decades, there's minimal information on what are the best psychological interventions for PMDD. What we do know is that PMDD is known to have poor executive functioning, heightened sensitivity to threats, heightened sensitivity to rejection, and a perceived burden on others. And people have expressed a need to learn how to cope with those symptoms and help navigate those symptoms over a long period of time. So this example quote here is from a health professional that works in adolescent mental health. And they say that although they may use cognitive behavioural therapy for anxiety and mood disorders, that there was no confidence in whether that was the right course of action for PMDD. So trying to find that out is really important. So we know that certain approaches like cognitive behavioural therapy or dialectical behavioural therapy can be effective for other mood disorders. And those mood disorders might have overlapping mechanisms with PMDD, for example, borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. So they potentially might benefit from similar approaches. However, there's just not enough research being done and not enough research data being collected in order for us to say that definitively. What we need for going forward is helping people and supporting people with functioning in everyday life, whether that's being able to function at work, function in relationships, function as a parent. So these lifelong coping skills were identified by stakeholders as really important. The third research priority was specifically around suicide and self-harm prevention. So although this is quite a long quote, we thought that this quite nicely presented the complex pathway of supporting people who have taken self-harm or suicidal action. So this is insight from a paramedic who says that normally a call around self-harm or suicidal action would result in the police being called first. And then when the paramedics arrive, they feel frustrated because the only pathway for them is to take the person to A&E. And the feedback from the person at A&E is that they are able to speak to someone, typically given a leaflet, and then sent home, and then the circumstances repeat themselves. So there's a lot of things that we still need to understand about this suicide and self-harm prevention. There's a lot of progress that we can still make. So what do we already know? Well, some work by key researchers in the USA found that 72% of people with PMDD experience suicidal thoughts, more than half will self-harm, and 1 in 3 will attempt suicide. So people with PMDD are a high-risk group for suicidality. Several systematic reviews have been undertaken showing a clear link between PMDD and suicide, and some of those authors' recommendations say that healthcare professionals therefore have a duty of care to explore the menstrual cycle in women and people who menstruate coming forward with self-harm and suicidal thoughts or action. However, what we don't know is whether there are specific suicide prevention and self-harm prevention strategies that work best for PMDD. So we don't yet know how best to tailor those services to people with PMDD, and we think alongside stakeholders, this is a really important area for moving forward. Fourth research priority is the impact of PMDD on life. So when we speak to people with PMDD, they are very vocal about the multiple ways that PMDD negatively impacts on them. They talk about the impact that it has on their education, and by that, high school education, college, university. They speak about the impact that it has on employment. People tell us about them quitting jobs or being fired from jobs, or being unable to take up new posts. And people talk about this consistent difficulty with maintaining relationships, whether that be romantic relationships, relationships with family, and also importantly, those who are parents having relationships with their children. So this example here is from a health professional who acknowledged the impact that they could see it was having on people with PMDD. So they're talking about families that they know that have broken up and being able to access council housing or needing extra support or having a breakup or being hospitalised, and they're acknowledging that this really adds up and takes a toll on people, and that kind of thing resonates really deeply with people with PMDD. So what do we already know about this topic? Well, from studies in other countries, we know that PMDD negatively impacts on multiple areas of life. We have data demonstrating burden on people's education, employment, and relationships. But what we don't know are the more specifics about what that context is like in the UK. And we don't know what interventions are best to support people with that. So if we're able to show interventions that can support people to stay in education, to support people to stay in employment, to support people to stay in long-term relationships and have healthier relationships with their children, that all has a knock-on effect on society, but we need to collect the data so that we can show that impact. And then we had this fifth research priority, where people spoke about hormonal trigger events. So in addition to the monthly fluctuation of the menstrual cycle, additional hormonal events occur throughout the lifespan. So we have menarche, which is the first period, starting and stopping different hormonal treatments. We have pregnancy, we have the stopping of breastfeeding, and we also have perimenopause. And people talked about these events impacting on them, but also highlighting that there was no information there to support them with that. So for this example, this person here with PMDD shows that the impact of pregnancy and breastfeeding had a huge effect and on their relationship with their partner. So what do we know about this area already? Well, there's limited data, but lots of anecdotal evidence showing a deterioration in PMDD symptoms following certain hormonal events. And what's interesting is that neuroimaging studies show that when hormones fluctuate, whether that's during puberty, pregnancy, or perimenopause, that they result in changes in brain morphology. For example, there are changes in the thickness of certain areas of the brain and changes in different areas which are activated in people with PMDD compared with people without PMDD. Now, that's, to someone who's not a neuroscientist, that sounds fascinating, showing that particular hormonal trigger events have this very genuine impact on the brain. And wouldn't it be fantastic to know more information about that? So having more information would help support people around these events. So although I don't have robust data to share, hypothetically, if a first suicide attempt by someone was when they were navigating perimenopause, if we have enough information on that, that is something that we could help prevent with appropriate interventions and support services. Okay, so if you remember, we said that there were these top 5 research priorities which came out of the research agenda, but there were also other research priorities and ideas raised by stakeholders. So I'll just quickly mention them as well, because some of them might be really interesting to everybody who's listening today, and some people might have questions on them. So one of them was around exploring the causes and biology of PMDD. So the cause of PMDD is very much an active area of research. There appears to be no one definitive cause, but there is a lot of research ongoing. So there are studies that suggest that fluctuating hormones driven by the menstrual cycle are a key mechanism of PMDD. And as levels of estrogen and progesterone rise and fall, this triggers a significant fall in blood serotonin levels. Another emerging hypothesis is that when progesterone breaks down into smaller components, one of those, known as allopregnanolone, has an impact on GABA receptors in the brain. And there are other studies which suggest there's a genetic component, changes in brain morphology, a mechanism around stress and trauma, and mechanisms around inflammation. So although collectively these studies are small in number, they are an exciting area of research that's going on just now. Another important area people highlighted was around other destructive behaviours that go along with PMDD. So, for example, this might be exploring the misuse of substances such as drugs and alcohol, or around disordered eating. As a specific example, 2 of my master's students looked at disordered eating in PMDD, and they found that people with PMDD have higher rates of bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and some interviews with people suggested that anorexic traits were also present. So this quote here kind of it goes along that line about restrictive eating. We also know that women are more likely than men to have eating disorders, but we don't know whether when people present at eating disorder support clinics, are they screened for PMDD, and vice versa. So these are some really interesting areas for moving forward as well. Another priority area was around surgery and post-op support. So the last line treatment in the guidelines for PMDD is removal of the ovaries, like a total hysterectomy. Now, there is support and information available for people getting to the point of surgery, but there's very little for afterwards. So there's very limited data on what happens to people post-oophorectomy, so post-surgery, and what their mental health trajectory is like afterwards. Another important area was around barriers to support. So we know from data on other disorders that certain groups of people experience barriers for mental health support. For example, people of different cultures and ethnicities and gender identities and disabilities. What we don't know yet is how these barriers manifest in PMDD. So we need to learn more about that so that we can ensure future management and support reaches all people affected by PMDD. And this example here was from one of our people with PMDD who was part of a support group for Black women and acknowledged that there was a cultural difference in how people speak about their mental health and access that support. And then a really important one is the cost of PMDD. So if there's ever going to be any significant changes in the health service or in government policy making, we need to demonstrate that PMDD interventions and support have value for money. And in order to do that, we need to start collecting the data now. So we are starting to work alongside a health economist to lay some groundwork for this kind of cost research so that hopefully in the future, we can demonstrate to the health service and to other policymakers that these interventions and support services are important, they can be delivered, they can be sustainable, and they can be value for money. And then that leaves us with a few areas that were identified by stakeholders themselves as important for future research. So I've just got a quick summary of them here. So one of them is around PMDD and neurodivergence. So there's some emerging data showing links with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism with the menstrual cycle, and particularly with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So some more research on that area will help support this group of people better. Much more research and action needed around education and training, and ideas that people brought forward were the education and training of different healthcare professionals, but also education in school settings, so that there was population-wide education for younger adolescent boys and girls on how the menstrual cycle can impact mental health, hoping that the long-term impact of that would be people being diagnosed earlier. The premenstrual exacerbation of existing disorders was also highlighted. So people don't just have PMDD on its own. Some people might have PMDD and comorbid bipolar disorder, or they might have PMDD and asthma. And understanding how that exacerbates those conditions, again, is really important, not only for the person themselves, but also for clinical practice. Issues around health service development were highlighted mainly by health professionals themselves. So this was tied up in their frustration with there not being effective referral systems and the right pathways in place. Something which repeatedly came up from health professionals was that they really needed multidisciplinary teams, because the issues around PMDD are so complex that they can't always be addressed by seeing a gynecologist or seeing a GP or seeing a clinical psychologist, but there had to be this holistic multidisciplinary team input. And a final one that was identified was around accessing support from the welfare state. So people with PMDD live with the impacts of their symptoms. For many people, this makes it very difficult to maintain employment. So in theory, they should be able to access support from the welfare state. So for example, things like personal independence payment, or in Scotland, it's now called adult disability payment. However, the assessment criteria are very difficult for people with PMDD to meet. And that is something that I'm looking at with a legal colleague at UWS as to how that assessment criteria can be fairer for people with PMDD who are unable to work. So that's a fly through of the key points of the research agenda. So we've found out about the priorities, but what do we now do with them? So what are the next steps? So we recommend 4 ways of using the research agenda. The first is around research. So what we're hoping is that researchers will use this agenda to focus their funding bids. So if we can show funders that these are the key areas which stakeholders have identified, then that will put us in a stronger position to obtain funding. The second is we hope it can be used around education and training. So for example, lecturers or training providers for healthcare professionals may be able to feed these research priorities into their training of future medical students or clinical psychologists. Also, researchers at universities also help identify topics for their postgraduate students. For example, I have several master's students just now who are looking at different aspects of PMDD, and hopefully other places will be looking at PhD students. And if they can help use the research agenda to identify topics, then that just helps build the evidence base. We also hope the agenda can be used for policy decision making. So again, this is very stakeholder driven. So policymakers sometimes develop and deliver their own interventions before they've went through a research process. So in those situations, using the agenda would really try and highlight these are the key areas to focus on. And then that leaves us with another potential use is from not-for-profit group activities. So because there is the lack of health service or government funded services, quite often you'll find these little support organisations pop up. And the agenda might be able to help identify relevant areas of support. For example, support groups around parenting or support groups around PMDD and disordered eating. So that's one other area that potentially the agenda can impact. So I thought I would just finish up by sharing a few things that we're aware are actually happening in the UK right now. So you may have heard of the PREDICT study. So it's run from the National Centre of Mental Health in Wales and is led by Dr. De Florio. And they're looking at how an individual's genes and environment can help identify people at risk of psychiatric disorders associated with the menstrual cycle. There's been work led by Dr. Sophie Hodgetts at the University of Durham, which has specifically looked at the impact of PMDD on relationships and partners. There are quite a lot of Masters of Public Health students just now. I have several at UWS. I'm aware of others at Imperial College London and the University of Manchester. Oh, and PhD students as well, looking at different topics. And I'm also aware of several trainee clinical psychologists and medics who are also looking at different topics as part of their training. Now, what we thought would be really helpful and useful would be to like create a mind map of different PMDD research activity in the UK. So obviously we won't have picked up on them all here. So if you are aware of others, then please do let me know and we'll try and feed that into some kind of helpful mind map. So that just leaves me by saying thank you for having me talk about PMDD today, and to signpost people to other resources. So you'll be able to find some really helpful resources at iapmd.org. They have resources for people with PMDD, their families, researchers, healthcare professionals. They also provide support, and there's definitely quite a few resources there which are helpful, as are the resources on the National Association of Premenstrual Syndrome in the UK, which is at pms.org. And our ongoing PMDD projects are on my research page, and there you can also sign up to a PMDD research newsletter where we hope to keep people up to date several times a year with UK PMDD research activities. And if anyone here lives with PMDD and wants to be involved in our studies, you can sign up to our patient insight group, and that gives you first access to any ideas that we're working on research-wise. So thank you very much, and I would be really happy to have a discussion or take any questions that people have. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lynsay. That was really, really great. Let me just, yeah, so does anyone have any questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute. While we're waiting, oh, Alexis, you do have a question. That's good. Okay. There you go. You should be able to speak, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynsay. That was really, really interesting. Interested in it from a research point of view and also slightly from a personal point of view as well. So that's fantastic. You were talking about, you know, what your guidelines could, you know, what your work could be used for. I wondered whether you'd thought about approaching different funders in the UK and in Scotland and just presenting your like ones that are, you know, commonly advertising grants, project grants for mental disorders, and seeing whether you can book in a chat with them and just present them, you know, some of this work and trying to get it on the agenda, because as much as we might be able to cite the work that you've done to try and say this is really important, perhaps there needs to be a bit like before that to try and get, you know, get funders aware of it, basically. I wondered what you thought about that.
It's not something that I've actually thought of before, and now that you're saying it out loud, I absolutely love it. It's a really nice proactive idea. Yeah. And yeah, so I think that's something that I think I could do, and I appreciate that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I know other people who've done, like, who've been involved with talking to the Wellcome Trust, like about different specialist areas, and then actually like 6 months later there's been a call for that, you know, a project on that disorder. So actually, given all the fantastic work that you've done, you know, I think you'd be in a really good position now to be able to say, this is what we've done and this is why we think there should be calls that are specifically looking at this, and just seeing how far you get with that, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic idea. I hadn't thought about it, and I will definitely take it forward. Thank you. Thanks, Alexis.
Cool.
Great, thank you. So Shona in the chat said, could you clarify the use of antidepressants in the treatment of PMDD?
Yes, so it's the first line treatment for PMDD, is the use of specific SSRIs, so serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. So they're specific ones which are shown to be the most effective. So they include fluoxetine, known as Prozac, sertraline, and I hope I'm pulling the right one off my head, paroxetine. And there has been really good work by a clinician and researcher in the UK. He's actually here, Tommy Riley's here, and he published a really important paper on the use of SSRIs for people presenting with PMDD.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so so my question is related to femtech and sort of period tracking apps, and I just wondered if during your kind of focus groups and stuff you found that people with PMDD are using those to kind of track their symptoms, not just for aiding diagnosis, but in order to kind of manage their symptoms as well. Did anything come up about that?
Not specifically in the focus groups, but from chatting within the PMDD community more generally, menstrual tracking apps are a really important tool. So yes, one, they can be used to provide evidence to healthcare providers around the pattern of cyclical symptoms, but a lot of people use them as a survival tool, and they talk about being able to predict when their next cycle will occur and being able to predict or plan ahead, you know, like survival strategies or wellness strategies. So some people speak about changing their work diary if they're able to predict when their PMDD episodes will come, or they might change their parenting strategies or enlist help with their parenting around those kind of issues. So I think they're a really important tool, which people seem to get a lot of benefit from.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's interesting to know. Any other questions from anyone else? I have like a list, so I can keep going. But if other people have questions, then I will prioritize yours above mine. So I'll be cheeky and go for another one. So also, yeah, so I was really, it was really interesting to see the role of education come up. I think it was in the other ideas from stakeholders, or yeah, I just wondered if you're aware of like any education in schools currently that's related to PMDD. Does it come up at all in the kind of in the sessions that people have on the menstrual cycle?
I'm not aware of any specific ones which are already implemented, but I know from chatting with NAPS, who are the National Association of Premenstrual Syndrome, that there were some things like that in the pipeline with some schools in England. So that might be a watch and see kind of thing, but I think it's a really important area for sure.
Yeah, great. And then I guess related to the sort of next steps, is there? I think that Alexis's idea about kind of getting funders on board with this is a really, really good one, and it's something we've been thinking about a bit with 4M as well. Is like, we need funding for this. Maybe we, instead of just waiting for the funders to put out the call, we go to the funders and say, you know, we've got a network of 100 people here and we're all wanting to do this sort of research, and can we have some money to do it, please? So if there's anything that 4M can do to help with that, then like, yeah, let's chat about that. That would be really good. And I guess as well with that kind of pathways to impact, in terms of what are the next steps for getting for example, education about PMDD into the curriculum. I don't know if you've like, do you have kind of ideas about how that would happen?
Just so I picked up correctly, were you talking about into the curriculum of training programs for healthcare professionals.
Oh, I actually meant like through schools, but yeah, I mean into the training, any kind of training would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, so in one of my previous posts at the University of Glasgow, I was involved in the kind of early setup of what's called the SHINE network. So that's around the health and wellbeing policies that happen within schools. So I then left that department, but what I picked up from that was just you really need really strong engagement from schools, and they need capacity to be able to work on those packages, education packages with you. So I feel as though that's a kind of long-term goal that has to be worked with the stakeholders alongside the stakeholders of the schools, and so something that probably has to start soon. So you have a lot. I think my understanding is the schools have a lot of barriers to bringing in new initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah, Julie's mentioned in the chat that we could also try pharmaceutical companies for funding, and Martin's mentioned you can incorporate into the nursing curriculum under the public health stream.
I'm looking at my other screens over here. That's where I'm looking at the chat. And one of the interesting things that came out of working with the stakeholders was that I would say a lot of the stakeholders had multiple perspectives. So there were healthcare professionals who also had PMDD, so they had two perspectives. There were many researchers who also had PMDD, so had two perspectives. And so I found that really interesting. And like, I'm not wishing to put anybody in the spot, but I just wanted to highlight that I know that Dr. Pooja Kuran is here today, and she's working alongside this organisation called REMO, which is around researcher mental wellbeing. And so I know that she's going to be presenting some work specifically around how PMDD impacts researchers, and how they can be supported to stay in employment. So that's like a nice wee tangent area, which is good as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, Pooja, I don't know if you, again, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. Oh, I actually have to unmute you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think I did mention, and hello, Lynsay. It's so good to hear you speak today. And so Lynsay and I wrote this abstract together with Claire from See Her Thrive in England, and our abstract got accepted just yesterday. So as I had mentioned in our previous forum meeting as well, that I'm really interested also from a personal perspective to look at the effects of PMDD, menstrual mental health in general, how it affects female or menstruating academics. So this will be the first time that we'll be talking about that in a mental health conference. So I'm very curious to see how it's received. We did get some very interesting reviews where they really want to see how we can make the study more robust. And I just have this preliminary idea that, so the conference is in June, and I would probably together with Lynsay love to work on a survey that I could send out to forum as well, and just like as wide as possible. Of course, we'll have criteria of which university, which country, age, demographics and everything, but just to understand people's experiences around it. Because REMO and Marie Curie Alumni Association are working with policies as well, and there have been changes proposed within these organizations that have made huge differences in the European Commission, and how universities follow taking care of their researchers. So there is huge potential to make an impact, a difference, and of course create education and awareness around menstrual mental health. So really hoping we can get the message across in international setting, European setting to start with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I just want to mention slightly that I'm from India, and I've been connecting with lots of Indian, people on LinkedIn recently, and there is a huge momentum here as well. Of course, there are cultural differences, but when it comes to menstruation and mental health being a taboo subject, I think we share that universally, unfortunately. But yes, even women here speaking about PMDD, I have never met maybe 1 or 2 people in my life whom I met in person who have PMDD. So that speaks volumes about the lack of awareness and education. But when you talk about symptoms and you share experiences, people are like, oh, I have this, oh, this person has this, or, you know, it creates a cycle of awareness. So I think it's just so important to keep talking about it and spreading the message.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I feel like there is a bit of momentum at the moment, and I think this PMDD or PMD Awareness Month, which just happens to fall within, has been, it seems to me to have been really useful in that regard as well, and the Emmerdale story and everything that you mentioned at the start there, Lynsay. So hopefully there will be this kind of momentum that gets some funding out there for research, and then that feeds into actually improving people's lives and their symptoms. Yeah, I mean, if there aren't any other questions, I don't think I've missed any. I think it's mostly just people saying that you've done amazing work, Lynsay, and I would echo that. It's really, really important work, and yeah, I mean, for 4M, it's absolutely great. As I say, if there's anything that we can do to help, then to help get the word out, we've obviously got a network of researchers that are all kind of primed, ready to help with this sort of stuff. So yeah, let us know.
Thank you. And I'm happy to, if anyone thinks of anything later, then just drop me an email. I'm always happy to chat about PMDD research, and myself and my co-author Julie's here in the background as well. Myself and Julie will happily chat with you about anything. Thanks for having us, Gemma.
Oh, no worries at all. Yeah, thanks for speaking. Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for joining. Yeah, and we'll be back next month with another 4M seminar, I hope. So yeah, thanks again, Lynsay. Thanks everybody.
Thank you. See you all later.
Bye.
Bye.